Hello, welcome back to the Troutman Pepper Battery and Storage Podcast. Today, my guest on the program will be Kunal Phalpher with Lime Metal Corporation. Kunal joined Lime Metal in 2022 as president. Welcome, Kunal.
Thanks for having me.
It's nice to have you on the program. You've got an interesting career story, and certainly your company is in an interesting space with the lithium ion next generation battery development. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your career journey? I know you started out in the renewable space and now you're with next generation batteries. Appreciate it if you could just walk through how you went from where you started to where you are now.
I spent about the last 15 years in, let's say, clean tech as an umbrella term. And as William was saying, began more on clean energy. So I was doing some stuff in solar and wind, and I was actually living in Germany for about 5 years. But naturally, as those two technologies started to come onto the grid, the topic around energy storage and batteries became more prevalent. And so I kind of latched onto that and transitioned to talk more and think more about batteries on a day-to-day basis. Worked for a battery company for some time here in Canada, and then eventually joined in various capacities from board member then to executive life cycle, which started about 6 years ago as a lithium ion battery recycler. And at that time, lithium ion batteries were just entering the market in various forms, from energy storage to EVs. And I helped scale that company over the last years from a startup to really a growth company that's now public and operational assets. But then last year's opportunity came to look at, just like I looked at recycling as a what's next question, Lime Metal, which has been working on some cool technologies for 3-4 years, and now looking at scaling up towards commercial scale with new anode technologies. I had the opportunity to come over as the president and help with various functions, including my core expertise in more strategy, business development, and work toward building out Lime Metal as a player in the new generation anode space.
Well, it's probably a good segue into Lime Metal's battery chemistry or makeup, if you will, this sort of lithium metal anode. If you could talk about that for a minute, and we could maybe geek out on the engineering and how that differentiates your battery and why you call it a next generation battery.
What we see in the market today is all really focused on lithium ion, comes in a different few flavors, and is what's powering today's EVs or energy storage batteries. All the gigafactories we hear about are scaling up. And one common theme within those batteries is they all have graphite on the anode side. That's one side of the battery. So it's just graphite and copper fairly consistently across those batteries. And what we're seeing is that a lot of work has been done on the cathode side, change chemistries, improve performance. But really in the next cycle of battery technologies, whether it's solid state or lithium sulfur or something in between, the work is really on changing out that anode side and using different materials to improve performance, safety, capacity of the batteries. And so Lime Metal was founded about 4 years ago, seeing that a lot of those new anode technologies require lithium in the form of metal. And there's a real gap in the market in terms of production of lithium metal, particularly in the Western world, in North America or Europe, to satisfy that eventual demand. There are other uses for metal in aerospace and primary batteries, or your little coin cells that aren't rechargeable. So there's an existing market as well. And in developing that lithium metal technology, understood that the groups really looking at these new age batteries are focused on the whole battery construction, but they do have trouble building the anodes themselves. So then the company started to look into how do we improve the process and technology to produce anode, which is basically plating, for example, the lithium onto copper or other metals. That's how we entered and started to develop that technology. So it's really, one's more raw material processing, transitioning lithium chemicals into metal, and two is then to build really a component for the battery, and all geared towards this next cycle of battery technologies.
Explain to our audience what the significance of that is. So you were saying there was a tremendous amount of focus on the cathode side, and a lot happened on the cathode side. What's the significance now with what's happening and what your company is doing on the anode side? And for the uninitiated, maybe I think I know what you're talking about, and I think probably a lot of people who are listening, but maybe some people won't know just the basics of anode cathode separator. Just maybe walk through some of that, if you will.
So you're really testing my limits on chemistry, but very simply, cathode is your positive side and anode is your negative side. Just like when you see on your AA Duracell or Energizer battery, there's a little
Sure.
positive, negative. Cathodes today are typically made with nickel, manganese, cobalt, also the iron phosphate, but they all are lithium containing. And as I was saying before, the anode is just a very simple graphite pasted on copper. You don't want those two pieces touching because that creates a short circuit and blow up. So the separator, as you pointed out, is a piece of basically polymer or sometimes ceramic or ceramic coated polymer that keeps those two separate. And basically, your lithium is transporting itself from the positive to negative side to create the electricity. So now by taking that graphite out and you're actually putting lithium on the negative side, you're creating a larger amount of lithium in the battery, which means you can have more per area, more energy transported. That's the real benefit is that you can basically make the same capacity battery half the size or half the weight potentially, or just make a smaller battery now for vehicles and get the same amount of range. But it also unlocks new technologies like lithium sulfur. So I mentioned cathodes, nickel, manganese, cobalt. There's groups looking at using a sulfur based, which actually then makes the battery even cheaper. And really, if that technology is to work and scale, it's a significant shift in how we make batteries for all these applications.
When we talk about energy density, then that's what this is getting into, right? And so for the EV side of things, this is a critical development.
Yeah, and there's two ways to look at it, which I kind of alluded to. One is the talk on EVs, which has died down, is about this range anxiety. Is there enough range? If you get into a 300-mile or 500-kilometer range, do you really need the 1,000-kilometer? That's a debate. So this technology would either say, okay, in the same space in the vehicle, I can now get closer to the 1,000-kilometer range. Or you can take the opinion, to make batteries and EVs more accessible. Now I can make the battery half the size.
Right.
So yes, you're using more lithium, but you're also reducing in parallel your nickel and cobalt. So in theory, over time, you could potentially reduce the cost of the battery by making a denser battery because your material usage is less.
And what effect does that have on the weight for the vehicle?
If you went with the same range but smaller battery, you can reduce the weight of the
Sure.
car. So if you have the same performance battery on a lower weight car, then your car is even faster now too.
No, it's interesting. Sounds like you guys have found kind of a niche and another way to come at this problem of range, energy density, weight, all positive developments on the EV side. So that's that's the part of your background that talks about applied science and electrical engineering. Now let's talk about your other part of your background, the Masters of Business Administration. So where are you on the business side of this in terms of forming partnerships and scaling up this idea?
I'll talk about the anode side. That's one component into new technology batteries that are being formed by other companies. So I would say the next generation battery companies, they've looked at, say, a cell as a whole, and, they played around with different components like different electrolytes and cell designs. They're all in a growth startup phase. They're trying to achieve first deliveries or samples to their customers, the automotive OEMs, who are just starting to put cars on the road with lithium ion batteries. So you are some years away from these batteries getting on the road, but on the road doesn't mean you're a commercial business because there's so many steps to get to that point. You can start in the phases of qualifying and testing, start to deliver a significant amount of material ahead of that in order to get it into the vehicle and approved for, say, roadworthiness. So most of the customers or potential customers are startups or early stage, or even if it's a larger company, it's an early stage technology. So that piece will take time to scale lockstep with our customers who are dependent on their customers. So we're kind of two steps away from the OEM. And that's kind of similar in the primary goal for a lot of them is to get into electric vehicles. I think some of them have a focus or a secondary focus on electric flight, which I would say I would read about before I started this job. Obviously, I tried to dive a little bit deeper because the ability to reduce the weight of the battery and have different performance characteristics lithium metal anodes really helps enable that for aviation applications. And I guess there's two aviation application. One is like hybrid electric for short haul flying. One is eVTOL, which is kind of again split into two. There's helicopter replacements. We've seen Archer announce this route from I think Newark to New York City. That's a helicopter replacement. Maybe that's a little bit more feasible in near term than autonomous taxis like Ubers in the sky, yeah, which is a little bit more down the road. There's a lot of potential and avenues and enablers there, but it's an uncertain timeline, I would say, that has various dependencies for the any business.
So what do you see as your next steps now that you've got the idea established? Where are you going in the business world with this?
Both the metal production and the anode production were working at different stages of demonstration. So the anode business, we're already sampling material to customers. We're working closely with them on their ramp up time, on their demand for the material and how that fits into our ramp up. The metal side, we're working still on moving that into a demonstration scale where we would then also have a different subset of customers. We can either feed our own needs with metal, but there's other demand for metal that we could actually more quickly, I would say, in more certain timeline, scale that to a commercial business in the next couple of years where we're selling metal, whether that's two batteries or not. Otherwise, in North America and Europe, you're importing metal from China. So localized demand or localized production is advantageous for security of supply chain reasons.
Well, certainly with the passage of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that is a concern that's front and center now too, in terms of North American supply chain. So I think that's an issue where you guys are well positioned, it would seem. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that. Certainly directionally, that puts some wind at your back, I would say.
Yeah, and I think even before the IRA, having been in the industry and talking to OEMs the last 2, 3, 4 years, everyone was looking to have a more, if you look at their existing parts supply around a car factory, they're all within a certain range. So the battery and the battery cell shouldn't be any different. But then the question becomes where the materials, the lithium or nickel or cobalt coming from. The IRA helps accelerate that. I mean, Europe has its own battery directive. You also have the inter-country agreements with USMCA. So you're really trying to have that secure supply chain to be able to build your vehicles and deliver the vehicles. Right now, it's hard to get any type of vehicle new for a few months. And so I think companies are aware of that and trying to help make sure that in this industry, you have that ability. Obviously, people are keen on having the metal produced in North America for these types of batteries. And then the next question is, okay, where will the lithium carbonate come from? Right now, there aren't major sources yet, but with all the investment that's been going on in the last 1 to 2 years, eventually you'll be able to also get the lithium sourced within the region and have a completely North American supply chain, for example.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of policymakers who are focused on that right now. As I said, with the IRA passage, it puts wind at your back in that regard. In terms of also financing, I think the Inflation Reduction Act creates options and advantages, maybe some tax advantages. I don't know if you guys have done a lot of thinking about that, but that's, I think, certainly an area for future consideration or future discussion. And then beyond those issues, in terms of business development, business relationships, where do you see the partnerships forming? Is it with the OEMs or is it with other battery manufacturers?
Yeah, right now we're talking to all of them, the OEMs and the battery makers. From my previous experience, the car companies were taking a more active role in, say, their lithium, nickel, cobalt supply chains and security of supply. So I don't think that can be ignored, that we need to make sure that we're talking to the OEMs. Most of the technology development of these new batteries is going on outside of the OEM. So we need to also be plugged in there. But I think over time, we'll see how that develops because a lot of the new generation battery companies are also funded or have investments from some of the major autos. And we know also some of the auto companies are also developing in-house some battery technologies. So it's kind of an all of the above scenario to pay attention to all of it and see where the actual demand comes from, as not every new technology being scaled is going to pan out. We have to see which are the ones that will eventually grow.
And with your Canadian background, do you envision centering on the Canadian market, the American market, internationally? Just talk for a second about your Canadian background and if that
Yeah.
has any impact on where you guys are sort of focusing your attention.
We're headquartered here in Canada. There's a lot of metals and mining expertise. So, particularly on metal production, the skill set, the engineering, the workforce you need is easily found here in Canada. Everyone talks about the IRA, but I'm constantly in touch with people from the federal government in different workshops to help establish the battery supply chain. We've seen all the cathode active material companies actually have come to Canada to set up shop. So there's definitely opportunities for us to build out some of our capacity here to serve the North American market. More on the metal side, I would say the anode business, as I said, is really the front end is the first step in battery production, and likely even with our technology would be inside a battery plant at the customer site. So we're a bit dependent on them there.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of activity right now in the United States in terms of battery factories. A lot of clients have expressed interest in that. And if you just watch the news, there's a lot of companies who are looking to set up shop in terms of battery production here in the States. And then you've got the various states fighting over where those factories are going to be located. So there's just a tremendous amount of activity in the space right now. But you guys have a component within the overall battery chain. So curious as to where you think that you'll set up shop producing your components.
I would separate again metal versus anode. Metal, the two key inputs are carbonate and electricity. So if it's close to carbonate supply or cheap electricity, those are guiding factors. You could ship it around North America, wherever. And again, the anode side would be customer dependent. Are there 5 customers in a certain state where we could build one plant and serve them all? Or is there one customer that's important in a different state and we just build something in-house for them? But I'm sure our customers are being contacted, and I've been in that situation where all the state economic development groups are calling you to say, come to our state. And similarly, metal, I think, particularly in Canada, there's also an opportunity to build it here potentially. There's no restriction in that sense.
This has been an interesting discussion. Why don't we just take a second here? If people want to learn more about your company, where do you suggest they look? Things like that. I think it's an exciting initiative that you're working on, and you've certainly carved out an interesting spot in the supply chain. Why don't I give you the floor here to let people know how they can find out more about your company and yourself?
Our website, lie-metal.com, has general information, updated corporate presentation, and also we're always posting on LinkedIn any new updates, etc. So you can follow LinkedIn, the company, or myself, and you'll get all the news that we're putting out and know what's up to date.
Well, we appreciate you being on the program. It's been an interesting discussion, and maybe we'll have you on again a little later once things develop a little bit more. How's that sound?
Love to be back, and pleasure chatting with you today.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.